My name is Shay, and this is Beverly Allen. I am the founder of a storytelling group here in Bend called Solo Speak, and Bev is the founder of the the Bend Storytelling Circle. And we are going to tell a story about Dorothy and George Putnam and Amelia Earhart, and this is what's called a tandem story. In other words, we're telling it at the same time. We take turns. We don't talk at the same time, but we're telling the stories together, which is called a tandem story. So we're happy to have you all here, and here we go. Dorothy Binney was born on July 26, 1888. She was a Leo.
Amelia Earhart was born on July 24th, 1897. She was also a Leo.
Dorothy's father's name was Edwin.
Amelia's father's name was Edwin.
And Dorothy always said that the women of her time could never really accomplish much because they weren't given enough to do. She felt society only wanted them to know how to dress and how to talk.
Amelia thought that feminine clothing restricted freedom of movement. Training and clothing hampered a girl's abilities.
Dorothy married George Palmer Putnam Jr. in October of 1911.
20 years later, Amelia married George Palmer Putnam Jr. on February 7th, 1931. Unlike Dorothy, she didn't change her name.
So Dorothy Binney was born in New York City, and her father was the inventor of the Crayola crayon, and it made him very rich. So when Dorothy was a little girl, they moved to what would become Greenwich, Connecticut, and they moved into a small house, and as the family grew and the money grew, it got bigger and bigger and bigger until it was a big mansion. The Binneys, Edwin and Alice Binney, were very forward-thinking people. They believed, and this was at the turn of the century in the 1800s, remember, they believed in the equality of men and women. And Dorothy's mother, Alice, was born in London, and she had a proper English upbringing, including going to university, which at that time in our history was very unusual. And one day, Alice sat Dorothy down. Dorothy was a little girl, and she said, "Dottie dear, you know that you're not pretty. So girls who aren't pretty really have to work harder on their other assets if they want to make something of themselves in the world." And you can imagine what this did to a little girl, to her self-image, that she wasn't quite good enough. And for the rest of her life, Dorothy would fight the low self-esteem, and she was always very happy and surprised when men fell in love with her, even though she grew up to be very attractive, if not a beautiful woman. On the other hand, it caused her to excel at single thing she did. She became the ultimate overachiever. And I can't help but think that that's a result of what her mother said to her as well. Her father, Edwin, of course, thought there was nothing she couldn't do. And he was an outdoorsman, so from a very young age, he took Dorothy with him everywhere. They went hunting, they went fishing, they went camping. She learned to fish at 2 years old. She could bait her hook at 4, and at 6, she could take the fish off the hook and gut it herself. For the rest of her life, the outdoors would be Dorothy's most favorite place, and when she felt the most at home. So she went to Wellesley College in Connecticut because it was a girls' school, and if she went to a girls' school, she could be on the rowing team because there were no boys there. And she, like I said, was an overachiever. She excelled at theatrics, she excelled at all of her studies, she graduated with honors, of course, and she became a wonderful musician. She was a wonderful, wonderful piano player. In her sophomore year, she and some of her friends went out west with the Sierra Club on a 2-month camping trip, and with the purpose of climbing Mount McKinley, which is the highest peak in the continental United States. While she was on this trip, she became enamored of this very handsome 21-year-old man who was acting as one of the guides for this trip. He was dark and handsome, and he was a reporter from San Francisco, a writer and reporter. His name was George Putnam. Well, George took one look at her, and let me put it to you this way, they just were inseparable for the rest of the summer. But when the trip was over, Dorothy had to go back to college, and George had to go back to San Francisco in his job as a reporter. But he wrote her every single day and even sent flowers to her dorm room about once a week. So when Dorothy graduated from college, they became engaged. And their engagement lasted for 10 months. And during that time, George moved to Bend, Oregon, and where he was writing articles for the Oregonian about the railroad coming out west and giving all the good points of Central Oregon and why the train should come to Bend. And while he was here, he bought the Bend Bulletin. There was a Bend Bulletin in 1910. And here's what you need to know about George. The name Putnam is from the Putnam, that's hard to say, Putnam Publishing Company in New York City. His family were very successful publishers, but he had come out west to make it on his own, and the Bulletin was exactly the kind of newspaper that he needed to make his mark. He took the newspaper from a weekly paper from a monthly paper to a weekly paper. Then, at the end of the 10 months, he went back east and married Dorothy. They had a lavish ceremony in her mother's house, and then they went on their honeymoon for 2 months. But it wasn't really a romantic honeymoon, it was more of a working vacation, because George was still writing for the paper. And he was interviewing dignitaries and looking at the countryside and the culture and the different things that the people did there. And Dorothy, because she was a college graduate, she was his helper. She would read all of his stories and type them up for him, and before they sent them back to the Bulletin to be printed in the paper. They had a wonderful time. They both loved the outdoors, so they spent a lot of time on horseback discovering all the countryside in South America. When the trip was over, George brought Dorothy to Bend, Oregon. Now, I can only imagine, this would have been 1910, and there were about 500 people in Bend then, and I can only imagine what it looked like. I'll bet it had mud streets, and the boardwalks were, up above high, made out of wood, and the women would have to lift their skirts not to get them all dirty. But he built the biggest house in town, 606 Northwest Congress. It's still there by Drake Park, and it's now like a B&B or something, and you could actually rent it for $4.50 a night. Dorothy thrived here. She brought her East Coast society ways to Bend, and she would throw lavish big parties, and some of them would be costume parties, and she would put on theatrical presentations, and of course she would play her piano all the time. Any civic thing that was happening in town would happen at their house. They even had church in their house on Sundays. While they were here, the mayor of Bend at that time fell out of a 2-story window and died. So the town thought, well, George would be the perfect mayor. He came from the East Coast, he knows what he's doing, he could clean up the town. So sure enough, he became mayor, and he put regulations on the taverns and regulations on the gambling dens, and he went out in the street and cleaned up all those whores. Then the war came. And at first George, the First World War this would be, at first George joined the Oregon National Guard. But then as the war got bigger and the United States was going into Europe and so forth, he was called back to Washington for the Army to be a war correspondent. He wrote during the war. So Dorothy and their child David was born when they were in Bend, and one of the reasons that they loved Bend was for the outdoors. Again, they were outdoor people. They'd get on their horse, they'd ride into the mountains for a couple of days, and as soon as David was able, they'd put him in the backpack and away they'd go. They felt that Bend was the best place to live. George Putnam always said he saw no other reason in the world to live any place else except Bend. So they all went to Washington, D.C. for the duration of the war.
Amelia Earhart was born high up on a bluff above the Missouri River in Atchison, Kansas. She was a tomboy. Well, I don't know if she showed up that way or if she was raised that way, but it doesn't matter. Either way, her parents encouraged her to be rough and tumble and fiercely independent. She wasn't a proper young lady at all. She liked climbing trees and playing football and baseball, and she was always up for a good mud ball fight. Her father bought her a rifle, her very own rifle. And what Amelia liked to do with her rifle is go into their barn and shoot rats. She liked to shoot as many rats as she could find, so sometimes it was hard to get her out of the barn. Well, her little sister Muriel, she thought that was kind of icky. Now, Muriel was 2 years younger than Amelia, and she was a tomboy too. And Edwin said that his girls could be as much like boys as they'd like to be. The family wasn't wealthy. They could have been. Edwin was well educated and intelligent. First he was an inventor, and then he was an attorney. But Edwin started drinking. And the family started moving, and they moved from place to place to place, always running away from Edwin's reputation and starting over in another town, hoping this time things would be better. And Amelia and Muriel had a hard time making friends because they moved all over the Midwest. They moved from Atchison, Kansas to Des Moines, Iowa, to Chicago, Illinois, St. Paul, Minnesota, and Kansas City, Missouri. Well, they were always the new kids, and so they were pretty surprised when they went to one school and some boys asked the new girls to come to a dance. Well, Muriel was 14 and Amelia was 16, and in the early 1900s, young girls didn't go out unescorted. But Edwin said he'd take them, and he'd even stay and dance with them. And they were so excited. And when the day came, they put on their party clothes and they sat down and waited for Edwin to come home. He said he'd come home early from work, so they expected him about 5:30. And the clock struck 6, and then 7, and then 8. And at 9 o'clock when Edwin came home, he was too drunk to take anybody anywhere. Well, Muriel was so mad that she stomped across the room, sobbing. You could hear her run upstairs to her bedroom and pound on her pillow. She was so angry with her father and so disappointed about missing the dance. But Amelia's style wasn't pounding and sobbing. Amelia just set her face and walked across the room, turned off the light, went upstairs to her bedroom and read a book. Her father disappointed her once again. What's new? It was the broken trust that hurt her more than missing the dance. She worshipped her father, but he betrayed her trust and her confidence one too many times. And it was this relationship with her father, together with how often they moved, that made Amelia feel like she could take care of herself. And she was determined to take care of herself. And she kept this feeling of independence all through her life, and never able to give it up for any relationship, even for love. But she was a happy girl. She did really well in school. She was very intelligent. But she didn't know exactly what she wanted to do with her life. When she was very young, she started a little scrapbook, and she kept in the scrapbook articles about women. There was women surgeons, women veterinary surgeons, women attorneys, women labor union leaders. She even had an article about a woman farmer. What all of these women had in common is they were pioneers in their field, and Amelia knew that she wanted to do something that wasn't traditional. She just didn't know what. She went to med school. She only went for one semester before she dropped out. And then she thought maybe she'd like to be a chemical engineer, but no, nothing seemed to fit.
The plan had always been, after the war, for George and Dorothy and David to go back to Bend. But George's uncle passed away, and so the family pressured him to stay back east and help run the publishing company. So they moved to Rye, New York, which is where George's family was from, and bought a house and started life up in Bryan, New York. Now, George now was going to an office in the city, and he had staff, he had secretaries, he had everybody to help him with his writing. He didn't need Dorothy anymore to do that. And she was now regulated to the home where she was the wife and the mother. They had a second child, George Palmer Putnam III, and who they called Junie. So she had 2 boys at home, and she was very good at everything she did. Her house was beautiful. She planted beautiful gardens. She gave wonderful parties, and now she was the homemaker. And even though she loved her family and she loved doing all of that, there was just something inside of her that this didn't satisfy her adventuresome spirit. She wanted to go out in the world, and she wanted to explore. She wanted to have adventures. She wanted to do something significant. And not significant as George Putnam's wife, but significant as Dorothy Putnam herself. So
she wanted to do something significant, and then George ended up going out of it.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. This is why we do it together, so we can help each other remember. George, on the other hand, was having all kinds of adventures because he was becoming a big shot in the publishing world, and he was very cutthroat to get whatever he wanted and to make money. And he found a niche publishing the books of explorers and adventurers. And pretty soon, he started going on these trips with them, like to the Arctic or to Greenland. Even when David, their son, got old enough, he went too. And David started writing a series of children's books, David in Greenland, David in the Arctic. And so George was out there doing really what Dorothy would have liked to have done. And then he got lucky. He got Admiral Byrd's book, and he published his account of his trip to the Arctic. And then he got Charles Lindbergh's book. Now, Lindbergh was a superstar at that point, because as you know, he was the first man to fly over the Atlantic Ocean. And flying was the thing then. Flying was just starting to happen, and it was very exciting for the country. And so George published Lindbergh's book, made a lot of money for Charles Lindbergh, and also made a lot of money for George. So now he decided that what he was really interested in was aviators. And he started scouring the country for any interesting aviators who had made some sort of a flight that nobody else had ever done, because he wanted their book. Then he heard about a project was being planned to send a woman over the Atlantic Ocean in a plane. Obviously, Charles Lindbergh had already done that, but no woman had ever done that. They didn't want her to fly the plane. They just wanted her to be a passenger in the plane. They were going to make her the captain. They were going to let her write the blogs, and they weren't going to pay her, but they were going to have 2 men fly the plane. She would just be in the back seat. But it couldn't be just any woman. She had to be charming, she had to be attractive, she had to be charismatic, and the most important thing is she had to be somebody that America would get behind and really cheer on and want to know everything about. She had to be somebody that he could sell her book.
While Amelia was dabbling around in college, she lived with her sister Muriel in Boston. But Edwin, it was 1920, and Edwin, he decided it was time to start over again. Amelia was 23, and Edwin asked Amelia if he would bring his wife, Amy, and Amelia's mother, down to Los Angeles to be with him, and Amelia could help her get settled. Well, Amelia said she'd do it, but she told Muriel she'd be right back. She wasn't going to stay in Los Angeles. But she got down to Los Angeles and she loved it. And she could be outside all the time. She could ride her horse, she could play tennis, and she really decided she would hang around there for a little while. Well, it was just after, it was 1920, and the war had ended in 1914, and the fighter pilots were, during that time, coming home from the war, and they wanted to show off their stuff, and also hope to make a little bit of money. So they were doing what was called barnstorming. They were landing in farmers' fields and doing a little exhibition, and then when people would come out to see their exhibition, they would charge them for a little flight in the plane. Well, by 1920, they started getting a little better organized, and more pilots were joining together, and the exhibitions got bigger. And Los Angeles was a perfect place for that because of the nice weather and the open skies, and so there were exhibitions all around, and Amelia went to every one she could find. Amelia loved watching the daredevils swooping and spinning and flying. It was only a matter of time before she had to try it. So she found a pilot that would give her a 10-minute ride, and she was hooked. Now, for me, I can't quite imagine what that first flight for her must have been like. She's out in the open air, she's got probably a little leather helmet on, and the gas and smoke fumes are belching over the fuselage, and nobody's adjusting the cabin pressure so that it'd be just so, there's no cabin. And I'm 100% sure there was no drink service after takeoff. But even with all of that discomfort, Amelia knew that flying was what she'd been waiting for all of her life. And she found someone to teach her how to fly. It was a woman, of course. Now, Amelia was hugely enthusiastic and intelligent and a quick learner, but she didn't seem to have any aptitude for flying. But given that fairly important drawback, it's really something that she was able to accomplish while she was in aviation. She flew all that she could, and it was an expensive hobby, and so at one point she had 3 jobs. She was a truck driver, she was a photographer, and she worked for the phone company. After she got a little better at flying, she even did a little barnstorming herself, but every dime she made went into flying. She was enjoying it. But Edwin started drinking again, and Amy was done. She was over it, and she wanted to go back to Boston with Amelia, and so Amelia took Amy back to live with Muriel. So there was Amelia in Boston. She spent all her money in Los Angeles flying. She had to find a job, and like happens with so many of us, she just stumbled into something she really liked. She got a job in a community center as a social worker. And she had no training as a social worker. But the director of the community center just was swept away with Amelia's charm. Amelia was tall and had gray eyes. She was boyish looking. She had a good sense of humor. She was direct, and she was firm in what she believed. But she was also humble. She just had that kind of personality that people like, and so the director hired her, and she loved her job. She was in an immigrant community, and she taught English, and she also helped the immigrants find their way in the new world. But more important than liking her job, she was making $35 a week. So she had plenty of money now, and she could fly all she wanted to. She was really aware of the fact that she was paving the way for women in aviation. And so she wanted to be as visible as possible so that other women would be encouraged to fly. And so she entered every competition that there was. And when George Putnam started looking for a woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, it was pretty easy for him to find Amelia Earhart. She wasn't the only woman pilot. She wasn't the best woman pilot. But she had the charm and the grace that would sell. And that's all George Putnam cared about.
The flight was dubbed the Freedom Flight because it was being done in cooperation with England. And it took many months and money and ups and downs to make this whole thing come together. But when it finally did, then the flight was delayed again and again and again because of weather. So Amelia was being housed in Boston with the 2 other male flight crew, and she was beginning to get a little stir crazy. And George was afraid she might back out because after all, she wasn't getting paid. So he asked Dorothy, his wife, if she would mind coming to Boston and keep Amelia company. Well, Dorothy was thrilled about this because it gave her a chance to be kind of part of this adventure, even if it's on the peripheral, but she could figure out what was going on, and she was really excited to meet this woman, this young woman who just took off in planes every time she wanted to. So they really hit it off. They were very similar. They were both tall, slender, athletic. They wore looser clothes so it wouldn't get in the way of their movements. And they both liked the outdoors, and they both loved flying.
Finally, they were able to take off. And after 20 hours and 40 minutes, the friendship flight, we called it the freedom.
Oh, freedom, okay.
They were free to be friends.
Okay. Friendship.
The friendship flight landed in Ireland. Well, they were supposed to land in London, but they ran out of gas and had to make an emergency landing in Ireland. But even though they were landed in this remote location, the whole world knew when they had landed because everyone was listening on their radios for what was happening with this flight. It's hard for us to understand why that was such a big deal. But in 1928, if you wanted to get from the United States to Europe, you had to first find your way to New York City and then get on a steamer that would take you 5 days to get to Europe. And here these three people had gone in a small plane over the ocean in less than a day, and one of them was a woman. Well, Amelia was really frustrated when they got off the flight because everybody was paying attention to Amelia. Nobody was paying any attention to the two men who'd actually flown the plane, and they were able to go off traveling around the British Isles and enjoy themselves while she dealt with all of the reporters and had to go to all of the entertainment and be in all of the lectures. People kept asking her, how did it feel to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean? She said, well, I was only a passenger. I might as well have been a sack of potatoes. She said that she did plan on doing it again someday, alone, as the pilot. And 4 years later, Amelia Earhart was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, and she did it in less than 16 hours. Well, finally she made her way back to the East Coast on a steamer. And when she got off the steamer, it started all over again. The parades, the lectures, publicity, people just all over her all the time. And she didn't particularly like all of the attention. She still planned to go back to work as a social worker. Little did she realize how much her life was going to change.
When Amelia arrived on the steamer, George and Dorothy, of course, were there to meet her. And Amelia ran down the gangplank and hugged Dorothy in a big hug and kissed her on both of her cheeks. It really surprised Dorothy because Amelia didn't greet anybody else like that. But at the same time, Dorothy was very happy about it because now she was friends with this exciting young woman. Amelia was about 10 years younger than Dorothy, and Dorothy would see her as not being restricted with the societal rules that Dorothy felt restricted by. And of course, Amelia looked up to Dorothy. She was everything Amelia aspired to be. But Dorothy looked at her and her free kind of life, and it made her think twice about her own life. And little did Dorothy know how much her life was going to change as well.
The whole agreement for Amelia to make this flight was that she would write a book. Well, of course, that's why George Putnam was involved. And he wanted that book to get quickly to press before people stopped talking about the woman who had flown across the Atlantic Ocean. So he told her that he thought she should move in with he and Dorothy and work on her book there with them and with his staff who could help her. And they could also help answer the more than 200 letters and telegrams she was getting every day. Well, and Dorothy could also help her in society, what to wear, what to say, because Amelia was clueless. So So Amelia moved in with George and Dorothy, and she stayed for 6 weeks.
So Dorothy had been helping Amelia choose her clothes and how to act in public, and now she resigned herself to the fact that if Amelia moved into their house, it meant that she would have to be taking care of more meals for not only her family, but now Amelia and George's staff people were there, and their front lawn was full of reporters and photographers 24 hours a day, just like Madonna. So Amelia worked very hard on her book. She would write several hours a day, but she always took a break every afternoon after lunch, and she and Dorothy would go for a walk, and most days they would go swimming. And once in a while, Amelia would take Dorothy up in her little plane, and that thrilled Dorothy to death.
Amelia was spending a lot of time with Dorothy, but she was also spending a lot of time with George. Well, she had to. He was her publisher. He was helping her get her career started. And frankly, turning a $35 a week social worker into a national heroine was no small feat. Well, George was always talking to Dorothy about Amelia, her gray eyes, her graceful hands, her intelligence, her friendly laughter, her winning ways. But it wasn't like he was talking about a person. It was like he was peddling on property.
So Dorothy and Amelia were spending less and less time together, and Amelia and George were spending more and more time together. And Dorothy was a little irritated with this new set of rules that were happening. I mean, she and George practically had a shallow marriage by this time. But Dorothy had a secret. She had something that George knew nothing about. She had taken a lover. A few months before, George had hired a young man named George Weymouth to be a tutor for their 2 boys. And when George Weymouth came to the house for the first time, it was in winter, and he went inside their house in their big foyer. He looked to the right, to the left, through the big living room, and there, with 2 big picture windows with a beautiful winter scene out there, and a big vase full of dried flowers, sat Dorothy at the piano, playing Chopin very passionately. He fell in love with her right then and there, even though he was 19 years her junior. So they started a passionate affair, and while George Putnam was in New York, spending more time with his business and Amelia, George Weymouth was at the house, spending more time with Dorothy.
Well, Amelia still planned to go back to social work. Or did she? She had to admit she was enjoying all of the attention from George. But she was starting to have quite a conflict about her friendship with Dorothy and her growing attraction for George. She was feeling a little guilty. But she figured out what she was going to do. She decided to dedicate her book to Dorothy.
Well, Dorothy's response to that was, is she dedicating this book to me because she likes me or because she's taking up so much of George's time? And they were spending a lot of time together, and rumors were starting. Is that where this part is? And rumors were starting among the press about George and Amelia spending so much time together, and there were also rumors among her friends.
Well, Amelia finished her book. And she said she just really needed a break. And she was just going to go vagabonding with her plane about the country. She gave every impression that she was going by herself. But alas, she was taxiing down the runway in Philadelphia. She just kind of put the nose of her plane down on the runway and crashed. Well, the crash wasn't a big deal, but Amelia Earhart was a famous person then. And so it was in all the headlines that Amelia had crashed in Philadelphia. And guess what? George Putnam was with her, and the jig was up.
So George had to confess to Dorothy about this misadventure. And for the first time she thought to herself, maybe this was what she needed to get out of this unhappy marriage that she was in. She had lots of money. She had more money than George, actually. And she could see for herself the first inkling of maybe she could create that independent kind of adventuresome life that she so longed for. And George Weymouth, is this right? Yes, George Weymouth, her young lover, was now becoming interested in a woman his own age. And Dorothy was now becoming interested in a new man closer to her own age. His name was Frank Upton, and he was a Congressional Medal of Honor winner for the First World War. And she was attracted to his celebrity, his heroism, and his rugged good looks, and the fact that he was paying a lot of attention to her. Their life at this point had become like a Shakespearean opera or Days of Our Lives.
Well, George turned his attention to Dorothy and tried to save his marriage. Amelia moved in with another female pilot and turned her attention to her career. Her professional life was making great strides, but her personal life was in crisis. People didn't have televisions in those days, and so what they did was went out to lectures, and they paid for lectures. And so if Amelia flew, then she was interesting and they hired her to speak. If she spoke, she had enough money that she could fly. So she couldn't stop. She had to fly to speak and speak to fly, and she was exhausted. And George was still with her all the time. Amelia wasn't able to promote herself, and rumors of their relationship were everywhere.
So Dorothy, tired of the rumors and tired of the marriage, decided that she was going to abruptly leave George, and she did it in the middle of a huge party that George was having at their house. One of the guests turned toward the foyer, and here were men carrying small pieces of furniture and boxes out the front door onto a truck. And here comes Dorothy, all dressed up in her coat with her bags, looking like she's going on vacation. And she sees him and says, "Don't you know I'm divorcing George?" And this is the part in the opera where the diva would sing. And she says, "I'm leaving George and I'm going to Reno for a quick settlement." And to Reno she went. And George wrote her miserable letters asking her to come back, but Dorothy had made up her mind, and 6 months later, she did get a divorce from George Putnam. And then 3 weeks after that, she married Frank Upton.
Dorothy married Frank Upton. Now her personal life really was in a crisis. Everywhere she went, people said, "Are you going to be the next Mrs. Putnam?" "No," she said, "no. Mr. Putnam is just my publisher. I'm not engaged to anyone." Well, Amelia didn't even have a positive picture of marriage. She thought being married would be like living in a cage. She said she might get married someday if she was unfit to fly. But when George could see that Dorothy really wasn't coming back, he really wanted to marry Amelia. And if you believe all the historical reports, he asked her 6 times. Well, I don't know if he asked her 6 times or not, but he was persistent, and finally Amelia said that she would marry George. It wasn't like it was a romantic moment. Amelia was getting ready to take off on a flight, and she turned back and got on the wing of the plane, and George had come to see her off, and she looked at George, she said, "George, I will marry you." And then she got in the plane and flew away. Amelia knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she was always up for a risk, and marrying George would certainly be a risk. But she convinced herself that he would handle even more of the grubby little details of her career. And really, she knew that somehow he seemed to understand her need for independence. He might be the only person that could put up with her. So the day came for their wedding. Amelia said no publicity, no fanfare. Well, that was really hard for George. Publicity was his whole life. But they got married at George's mother's home with just a couple of witnesses. But just before the wedding started, Amelia asked George to come aside and talk to her. And she gave him a letter she'd written just that morning. She found some stationery at George's mother's house. And she asked George to read the letter. So he did. Dear George, you must know again my reluctance to marry. I feel the move just now as foolish as anything I could ever do. I know there may be compensations, but have no heart to look ahead. I mean, this is just minutes before they're getting married, and she's telling him it's the stupidest thing she's ever done. I want you to understand I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself so bound to you. This is 1931, and she's suggesting an open marriage. Well, one wonders if she already has somebody else in mind. I must exact a cruel promise, and that is that you will let me go in a year if we find no happiness together, and this for me too. Well, she certainly had her escape plan already. And she closes. I'll try to do my best in every way and give you fully of that part of me you know and seem to want. Amelia, February 7th, 1931. Now, most of us have a bit of a reaction. We're just getting married and somebody hands us a letter like that. But George Putnam just smiled and nodded and took her hand, and the wedding proceeded with no further display of affection. They went away for the weekend to an undisclosed location where reporters wouldn't come and bother them, and then they were back to work. They kept separate finances. They split all their expenses right down the middle. Amelia didn't change her name. She called it a marriage with dual controls. And George got increasingly concerned about Amelia's flying. There were lots of accidents and mishaps. It wasn't all Amelia's fault. It was aviation at the time. And one flight that she was on, the door flew open, and Amelia couldn't get it latched again. And so she had to hold it the whole flight while she flew with her left hand. Well, she couldn't land. She was trying to set a record. But even though George was concerned, he never tried to talk her out of flying. And that's part of why their marriage worked. They were both really, really busy and always flying about. George doing his publishing and promoting, and Amelia doing her flying and lecturing. And so they had few times they could be together at their house in Rye, and they cherished those times together. They both really enjoyed being outdoors, and they both loved to work in the garden that Dorothy had created. They both loved it.
They did. Good. I'm glad I'm not the only one. Is this the time they were looking at the news?
They were. They both loved it when they could be together in Rye. And Amelia was happier than she expected to be. Well, one afternoon they were there at their home in Rye and sitting in the parlor on one of those rare days when they got to be together. And George was reading a book and Amelia was reading the paper, when she remembered that there was something she'd wanted to tell George. And so she folded back just the edge of the paper and looked over and got George's attention. George, I'm planning to fly around the world, and I'm going to do it at the equator. That said, she could go back to reading her newspaper. In true Amelia style, that's the way it went down. And George Putnam wrote later that he just was thrilled to be in the presence of such a brave woman. But he also had a sense of dread. Flying around the world was the ultimate challenge, and only a few pilots had been successful, and none of them had flown around the equator. But he didn't try to talk her out of it, but he did tell her time and again that she could back out at any time, that they had a life outside of flying. And it wasn't going to do anything for her career particularly. She was already the most famous woman pilot in the world, before or since really. And this flight wasn't going to make her more the most famous woman pilot. But she told George she just wanted to do it. She said, if I should bob off, it'll be doing what I've always wanted to do. And so they both threw themselves into it. It was a lot of work to get ready to fly around the world, and there were mishaps and changes that needed to be made to the plane, and weather delays, and all kinds of frustrations. But finally, on June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart was able to take off on her flight around the world. It was just a few weeks short of her 40th birthday. Even though it was 5:30 in the morning when she took off, there were more than 500 people showed up at the Miami airport to see her off. She and George had a quiet goodbye. They were sitting on the wing of her plane watching the sunrise, holding hands. Well, George wanted those minutes never to end. But Amelia was kind of anxious to get going, and so she got in the cockpit and flew away the minute she was gone. Her schedule was grueling. Every day she had to update her logs, she had to work on the book she was writing on, she had to replan her routes because of weather changes, and still try to get some rest. But even though she had a schedule like that, every day she found time to write to George, even if it was just a line. She wrote, I wish you were here, so many things you would enjoy. Maybe someday we can fly around the world together, just for fun. She was really enjoying seeing the world. But George was getting more and more concerned. He wanted her home. She'd been gone for a long time, and his letters were getting more emotional. George wrote to Amelia, Dear Hun, how I wish this flight wasn't hanging over us. You know that I empathize with your ambitions, and 98% I think you'll get away with it. But we both know the hazards, and I love you dearly. George. Well, it's just, and Amelia wrote right back when she got George's letter, please know, I'm well aware of the hazards. I want to do it because I want to do it. Women need to try what men have tried, and when they fail, their failure must be but a challenge to others. It was just a few days after that they lost radio contact with Amelia Earhart, and she didn't arrive at her next destination. It was July 2nd, 1937, and it was the day before she was supposed to be on the last leg of her flight and arrive home. She was planning to be in a 4th of July parade to celebrate her return. Well, George just couldn't believe Amelia was gone. So many times he'd waited for her on dangerous flights, and she'd always shown up. And one time, people even came and reported to him that she had crashed and burned, and somebody ran right in afterwards and said, no, it's fine, she's fine. And he just kept expecting somebody was going to come in and say she'd been rescued. But days and weeks went by, and the government finally gave up the search after spending, even in 1937 dollars, $4 million. But George didn't give up. George just got more desperate. George tried everything. George looked everywhere. George followed every lead, even the scammers, until finally George had spent all of his fortune trying to find Amelia. But on January 6, 1939, 18 months after Amelia disappeared, she was declared legally dead. George was never the same after May disappeared. He got older somehow.
Frank Upton turned out to be a drunk who beat her, so Dorothy divorced him, and she married 2 other times, and finally finding some happiness with her 4th husband, Lou Palmer, in Florida. She died when she was 94 years old, but that's a different story.
George Palmer Putnam, never a man who liked to be alone, he remarried 5 months after May was declared dead. He married Jean Marie James, and they were divorced a couple of years later, but he finally found his happily ever after partnership with Margaret Haviland, who he was married to until he died at 62.
That's the way love works sometimes.
It doesn't seem to matter if you're the most famous woman pilot in the world.
Or the Crayola crayon heiress.
Just move along through your life, hanging on to whoever you can, falling in and out of love.
And somehow we just all seem to make it worthwhile, don't we? Thank you so much for being here today.